Welcome to another edition of the Basketball Teacher Podcast. Our mission is to bring you discussions on a wide array of topics in the coaching world to grow players on and off the court. You can connect with us on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, and also reach us directly through email at basketballteacherpodcast@gmail.com. Now, here's your host, Coach Mike Hernandez.
Welcome back, everyone. Thank you guys so much for joining us here for another episode, wherever in the world you're listening to us from, whatever platform you're listening to us on. Thank you guys so much for joining us. This episode is one that is really interesting and really something that I'm glad I'm able to get a discussion in on, because we're going to talk a little bit of AAU and high school basketball, and specifically the partnership, or in some cases maybe the lack of partnership where there should be one, between AAU coaches and high school coaches. I think for anybody who's been involved in the high school game for any length of time knows that this is sometimes a real tricky area, the partnership or the relationship between a player and you and the player and that AAU coach, and the way you talk with that AAU coach. There's a lot of interesting things to kind of unwrap and discuss. And I'm not saying we're going to have all the answers here today, but I think what this episode will do and what this discussion will do is hopefully open up maybe some discussion points, get you some new thoughts, some new perspectives, and hopefully just make us that much better when we're talking to, whether it's a high school coach or an AAU coach, to just ultimately make the experience better for our players. So this will be one that I think everybody listening will be able to get something good out of. And I'm really happy to have to join me to discuss this topic. He is an AAU coach for the RS Gold AAU team. Very happy to be joined by head coach Ruben Lopez. Coach, thank you so much for joining us. How are you?
How's it going? How's it going, everybody? Thank you very much for having me. This should be fun. Like you said, this is a very interesting topic, a topic that can have about 1,000 different perspectives for sure. So it'd be interesting to see, and it's a good dynamic. The fact that you're a high school coach yourself, I'm coming from the AAU side, so this should be fun.
Yeah, and let's get started, Coach, with your journey. Where's your basketball journey, and where's your coaching journey? And I think specifically for this question, I'd be curious, as you talk about your basketball and coaching journey, what got you interested in coaching AAU as well, if you wouldn't mind touching on that as you go through your journey here.
Yeah, of course. So sports has always been a big part of my life, since high school. I actually wasn't necessarily big on basketball when I was younger. I was a football player and kind of emphasized that. But as I grew, I learned to really love the basketball game. I love to play football, but I love to watch. I love to really study the basketball game as a whole. And I used to be in the military. I spent 11 years in the Air Force. And while I was in the Air Force, I had my kids. And they began into their own sports world. And when I left the military, I came back home here to El Paso, Texas, and came back to my community, basically where we're from. My wife started teaching at an elementary in our area. And with that, I kind of gained a connection. I started getting my kids into sports. And essentially what happened was I took my son to a basketball team. We went to a couple of practices where the coach brought out a bag of basketballs, dumped them out in the middle of the court, and said, all right, guys, grab a ball. And I guess my wife got a little frustrated at my frustration and how I was voicing the frustration of what was going on. And essentially she said, well, if you don't like it, why don't you start your own team? So I started my own team. I went on and I went to my small community that we're from, through the elementary that my wife was teaching at the time, and put out a couple of flyers, hoping to get a handful of players enough to form a team for my son. And ended up by the end of practices and everything, the first few practices, I ended up having to make. I had 2 boys 4th grade teams, 2 girls 5th grade teams. 2 boys 4th grade teams, 2 5th boys, 2 5th girls, and a peewee team that I ended up with after
Wow.
2 practices. So the way I got into the AAU world was essentially the progress and the development that I had in my small little elementary age teams, the just the dedication and the progress that was being shown by the players just demanded a lot more from me as a coach, and it demanded a lot more competition for them. And it just kind of evolved into a travel program that we are now, where we've been a true travel program for about the last 4 years, where we're emphasizing going to NCAA type tournaments and getting girls recruited into college basketball.
I wanted to ask, just as kind of a follow up to that, because I know that there's coaches who are perhaps interested in the AAU world, or starting up an AAU program, or having an AAU team of their own that they might end up inheriting and coaching. Can you talk a little bit about what the time commitment, especially in the beginning, was like for you as you were getting that going, especially when you had so many players who were interested in so many teams? What was kind of the process, I guess, in terms of how much time it took for you to really kind of get things going and get things moving with that?
The time commitment in terms of like practices and games, to me, that's the fun part.
Mm-hmm.
So I never really see that as as a burden, or as kind of a time consuming, I guess, in that sense. The preparation aspect of it, I think that's very much up to you as a coach, as an individual, and what you're really planning to get out of being an AAU coach. Because you can be a show up on Sundays type of coach, and as long as you have the right players, you can be successful that way. But if you are really looking to develop players, which is my emphasis when it comes to my coaching, is just 100% on development versus winning or any other aspect of basketball. There's definitely that time outside of just the general practices, planning practices, so that whatever you're doing at your practice is you're maximizing that time. In AAU, we don't have the luxury of a high school coach, where we have practices every day. One of our high school classes is basketball. We see our kids in high school. You see your kids 6 times a week. In AAU, we just don't have that luxury. So if we have an hour, like myself, I practice twice a week for about 2 hours a week, 2 hours of practice, excuse me. So you really have to emphasize the time that you spent with those kids, and the planning phase of your practices is crucial to that. So really, you're talking about obviously several hours in researching and putting things together, research and development type stuff. So I mean, the time commitment is definitely something to consider.
Yeah.
But if you're passionate about coaching, I don't necessarily think that it becomes a burden.
Yeah, it's just no. I mean, I totally agree that it has to be one of those things where you really have to be really efficient with your time. That's for sure. If you're going to have limited practice time, which we all know exists in the AAU world, you just got to really, if you want to have a successful team, like you said, focusing on development over wins, you really got to make the most out of that gym time, because you can't just roll out the ball on Sunday, like you said, and expect that your players are developing necessarily. But, as we all know, like every AAU program is different. Everyone has their own different priorities, but I really like what you're doing, because it's focused on development, and just is kind of almost like a little bit of a segue to, I know, something we'll talk about later. Like, I imagine that a lot of the high school coaches or coaches that you talk to or perhaps work with are probably happy that you like to focus on the development aspect versus just trying to win as many tournaments or showcases as you possibly can.
Absolutely. And I'll say that most high school coaches are definitely happy of the fact that you're helping develop players in the area. When it comes to like recruitment for coaching, one of the things that I've learned throughout the process is the more talented the area that you play in is, just the more attention you're going to get in general for everybody. So if you're playing against top level talent, it's just that much more likely that the area is going to be recruited, and that means looks for everybody here. So here in El Paso, I think we're definitely an ascending region when it comes to being recruited, especially on the girl side. But it's all coming from because the general talent in El Paso has skyrocketed in the last couple of years. There's a lot of AAU programs, a lot of people that are really doing things the right way. That is improving the talent pool. And because of that, we're really getting notoriety, and we're getting a lot of attention from the college coaching world. So I think everybody should be happy if anybody's developing talent in your area.
Yeah, 100%. Before we really dive into this topic, I know that you are a PE teacher and work in physical education. And I always like when I have guests who are in PE specifically to talk about what they currently see as like the state of physical education, because it's one of those subjects I feel like is just so different from state to state and area to area. And there's so much variety in so many different ways that PE is emphasized or talked about or even taught. So I'm just curious, where do you currently see the state of like PE in your area, and where would you like to see it kind of go in the future?
That's an interesting question. I don't have a lot to compare with, because I've only coached here in Texas, and then I've only coached in the PE world in one district. So it's really hard to say, because even we have a handful of districts here in El Paso. So even within the districts, there's definitely a lot of variety. As a sports coach, I think I would love to see a lot more skill development going on during PE, although I'm sure that's controversial, because that's not necessarily the role of a PE coach. But I think that you can do the role of the PE coach. You can follow your TEKS or the curriculum, and still within the games that you play, still emphasize skill development. So it improves the talent level as a whole. You got middle school coaches that are already starting at just a little bit higher level than they have to, versus having to basically teach a kid how to dribble right from a seventh grader how to dribble, or a seventh grader how to put his fingers on the laces football wise, that kind of thing. So what I've noticed in terms of trends, I think that there's a lot of invention, a lot of what's the word I'm looking for? There's just a lot of new concepts that are being introduced just for the sake of being new or being different. Where we're playing a lot of really fun games with a lot of really cool rules, but the emphasis on any actual skill development or the emphasis on a healthy lifestyle that PE is supposed to teach kind of goes out the window. So we're being innovative for the sake of being innovative. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And then, like you said, it's so hard to talk about, like, I guess, PE as a whole, right? When everybody kind of does something differently. You have ones who are, I've seen programs that are very like health based and very focused on the health education aspect and more in like healthy living. Some are very big on sports itself, and some who are kind of more on the emphasis of, like you said, kind of like skill development and working on things differently. It's one of those that, for better or for worse, I feel like doesn't have a lot of oversight usually on it. So you kind of get like every kind of experience and almost like anything could potentially be happening in the PE world, hopefully for better. But it just seems like there's a lot of freedom there. At least that's my outsider viewpoint on it.
And absolutely, that's actually a great point. There is so much freedom. So nowadays, at least here in Texas, where we have the standardized testing, teachers are being held to such a high standard. There's so many things and kind of dots that they have to, or T's that they have to cross and I's that they have to dot. And in the PE world, that's just not the case. You're given so much autonomy and you're given so much freedom that you can make your program whatever you want it to be. And unfortunately, with that freedom comes the types of programs that, well, they kind of the bare minimum type of programs because of that freedom. And then, obviously there are the programs that use that freedom to just be, like I said, just be innovative and be an extension of that classroom, which I think is one thing that also kind of gets forgotten by a lot of PE coaches, is that we can be such a tool in the kids' learning process in the classroom as well. Just the discipline, the things that we teach in the PE classroom can extend to the regular classroom, and we can reiterate lessons from from their actual classroom into the PE world. It should be again a partnership, and I think we're going to talk about partnership as well when it comes to the AAU.
Yeah, it kind of fits in, right? It's like a natural transition about the topic of AAU and high school coaches and the partnership that hopefully would exist between the two. And I guess to kind of start to kind of get a frame of reference from your experience, what is, from what you see, maybe not just necessarily with you, but also if you want with other AAU coaches, what's kind of the state of the partnership that exists that you see between the AAU and high school basketball coaches in your area? How do they work together, if at all?
Well, here in El Paso, so we have a handful of kind of the top tier type AAU programs that get a certain level of respect from high school coaches just because of the trajectory and the things that they've done. And then we have your standard kind of city league type teams that are just as valuable, but maybe don't have the history, because a lot of those a lot of those city league teams are kind of newly formed and barely kind of getting feet under them. So there is quite the spectrum here in El Paso in terms of the relationship between that AAU world and the high school world. And I think it's an evolving relationship. I think it's very dynamic right now, and I think it's transitioning. At least in my experience here in El Paso, there was a time where the AAU there was maybe one, maybe two really prevalent teams. And that meant 10, 11 girls in the entire city, that were. So if you were lucky enough to have one of those girls on your team, it was definitely a positive when it comes to being a high school coach. But that's changed. And like in college recruiting, for example, a lot of college coaches emphasize the AAU side of things versus the high school side of things nowadays. So that relationship is definitely evolving and transforming. And here in El Paso, that spectrum is wide. You have programs that work really closely within the restrictions that we have through UIL, the governing body of high school sports here in Texas. But you also have coaches on the other end of the spectrum that just refuse to work with AAU coaches, and vice versa. AAU coaches that just refuse to have any sort of relationship or contacts with high school coaches, which ultimately is just detrimental to the player themselves.
And just for reference, what is the age group of your current AAU team?
I have JV and varsity girls. So
okay, so they're right 17. In the thick of their high school career. Then they're right in it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I started with them pretty young. That one of the really cool things about our program is that since I started with that kind of a little bit of a farm league there with the elementary age kids, and then we've all kind of grown together. So my program has grown at the same pace, or kind of had that symbiotic relationship with the growth of the players. So as they've grown, they've demanded higher level coaching from me. They've demanded higher level competition, and then we moved on to the AAU world, which is what we emphasize. Obviously, the getting girls recruited and getting girls to fulfill their basketball dreams, hopefully.
And so in that time frame, you must have had to yourself interact with and work with a lot of coaches as your players have gotten older and older. Am I correct in that?
Yes, absolutely. And the nature of my program, I had a large group, I had a good group of players that went to the same high school. Mm-hmm. But then as the program grew, I started getting players from high schools all over El Paso. So now, as we sit right now, I have players pretty much all over the city. So the relationships are definitely different with each high school coach. Some I have zero relationship with, not on purpose, not because they're shut me down or anything. It's just that it hasn't presented itself. And then I have really strong relationships with other coaches as well. So even within my program, there's quite the spectrum of when it comes to the relationship.
And just to kind of add on to that, what was that process like for you as your players started to branch out and be at different programs and different schools? What was the process for you to reach out and talk to those coaches? Did you find that was something that, in general that the other coaches were really like receptive on? Did you find you had to put a lot of work in? What was that like, just trying to get to know who their coaches were and have those initial conversations?
Definitely early on when my players were getting into the high school world, when I had a lot of freshmen, a lot of players that you knew were likely going to become, varsity level players right from the jump. And I wanted to make sure that my players were prepared for that. As my players were growing, I was growing as a coach. I was afraid that if I plateaued as a coach, they were going to plateau as players. So especially early on, as these eighth graders are going to move on to high school, I reached out to a lot of different coaches. I think at that point, I maybe hadn't really developed my identity as a coach and my coaching philosophies, or I hadn't honed them in yet, basically. So I was reaching out to see what was being emphasized in these different programs so that my players could be ready to basically hit the ground running as they came to those individual programs. I didn't get a lot of response. I had one particular coach that definitely was the most receptive, and just with conversations with him, I think I understood a lot. And then one of the things that I learned is that as long as I focus on the development and the skill development of my players, they'll fit into any system. So rather than having me emphasizing like teaching a specific system or emphasizing something that's going to be run in a specific system, I teach skills, I teach actions. And that's something that I learned in the process. And I think I've been pretty successful with since. So rather than teaching plays in my program, we teach how to play. And then you can take those concepts to whatever play your coach is going to teach you.
And I think that's one of the biggest concerns that a lot of high school coaches have, and maybe why sometimes that relationship is a little complicated, is because high school coaches are worried that maybe perhaps their AAU coach is trying to have them learn a different system and unlearn things that they, as a high school coach, had tried to teach them. And so sometimes I feel like that just creates an adversarial or a difficult relationship right off the bat, because there's that fear of like, oh, what new things is this, AAU coach going to be trying to like teach my player when I want them to, hone in and learn on like the system that we're currently running.
Right. And I guess if there's something that I kind of defer from a high school coach, and really that comes from, in my opinion, it comes from the demands of the position. So high school coach, whether they like it or not, they have certain expectations of success and of winning, right? A lot of times their jobs are dependent on a certain amount of success. So, not necessarily winning championships, but I mean, you can't go 0-18, 4 seasons in a row. And I don't have that. I don't have, it's my program. It's a voluntary program. It's a free program. So I don't have those demands. If somebody wants to play, I'm basically going to coach whoever wants to be coached by me. So because I don't have the demands or the expectations, I can really emphasize on development. And coaches in high school will run a lot of plays that when the high school players come back to me, one of the things that I kind of have to push them away from is just kind of the robotic, make the next pass because that's what the play dictates, versus reading defenses, recognizing space and the kind of concepts that make you a better all around player versus make you better at running that play. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah. And there's probably, again, I think all high school coaches would probably wish that all AAU coaches were like that, and would probably make their day a lot better if they knew that that's what was happening in the AAU world. And I'm sure, and you can speak to this, that I just know as a high school coach and somebody who talks to a lot of high school coaches, that there's just this idea that there's AAU coaches who just aren't doing any form of teaching and just running their players out in these showcases and tournaments and just burning them out and not teaching them anything. And then they're scared of that happening, where, players are just playing all the time and not really learning anything. And I can imagine that there could be that initial like skepticism perhaps that existed with your program, where they're trying to figure out like, are these players really going to learn anything there? Or are they just like playing a bunch of games sort of thing?
Absolutely. I think that's where really you have to emphasize those relationships and the communication between them. And not necessarily so that I can tell you how to do your job or you can tell me how to do mine, but just a conversation with another coach, I think you can really glean their, first of all, what they emphasize, secondly, kind of their level of knowledge, and you can gain a certain level of comfort in like, okay, well, this guy is at the very minimum is saying the right things, and looks like they have at least a working knowledge of the game. So maybe I give them a little bit of flexibility and maybe let them work a little bit, and then see what the results, right? For the most part in the AAU world, we have there's a trajectory there, there's a history there, there's results. You can see the results. You can see the results both in the development of players, in local leagues. You can see which programs are usually at the top of the leagues. You can see on Twitter and social media who's out there winning tournaments. So I think if you just, as coaches, if we just communicate a little bit more, I think you can see like, okay, you know what, this coach right here, I'm probably not going to give a lot of leeway to, because it's just a coach that's going out there to throw some players on the court. But this other coach, maybe we need to really nurture that relationship, because I want more of my players to go to that coach.
And that I think speaks to also, as I'm just kind of thinking about that, like the importance it feels like for a lot of AAU programs to really put it out there, what they're doing, the things that they're teaching, whether they're putting it out there on social media or whatever the case may be, because I'm sure, and I've been in this position as well, a lot of high school coaches are looking to, get their players like set up with good club teams or AAU teams if they don't have any of their own or can't do it for time commitments or whatever. And I can speak in the Phoenix area for sure, and I'm sure it seems like it's grown in your area, that there's just so many AAU teams out there that it's very, very difficult for a player, and even sometimes a high school coach, to even know which ones are good and doing the right things. And so I feel like what you're doing of kind of, promoting all the things you're doing out there on social media and really getting your program out there can definitely help a high school coach like, okay, this is where I want, my player to be playing club, or at least take a look at this particular AAU team.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something that I wasn't really the best at initially. And I'm definitely not super active on social media. Now I'm not a social media person in my personal life. So that extends a little bit to where, I definitely have to put in effort to do the social media stuff for our teams, but it's definitely a whole new world. I mean, there's a lot of recruitment going on, and just via Twitter. So, and the other social media platforms. So it's something that you either adjust to, or you're going to go by the wayside. But you're right. The more that's out there, because there's programs here that have a kind of national level, or at least regional or state level kind of allegiances.
Yeah.
So that, you have a team that has a program here in San Antonio and Dallas and Houston, and just with that name alone is going to come a certain level of respect, and I don't have that. My program came, we kind of grassroots type of program. So it's that much more important for me and my team for us to get ourselves out there and make sure that people know what we're doing, the positive things that are going on in our program, the success that the players are having, both from a college recruitment standpoint and from the success that our team is having from a tournament standpoint.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have instances that come up now, especially as your players are getting into deep into their high school careers, of trying to balance being comfortable with playing for both coaches? I know one of the things you really emphasized was that you're big on development, which I think helps a lot. But do you ever have these conversations with your players when you're coaching them or trying to develop them, where they have well, my high school coach says this, or, my trainer says this, or whatever the case may be? And if so, like, how do you kind of work through those things?
Yeah, that happens, absolutely all the time. I have a group of players that have been playing for me since they were in 5th grade, and now they're seniors. So just they're going to have, I guess, a little bit more allegiance toward our team, toward our program and what we do, because they've been doing it for so long, and that's all they've known. So they've had a different middle seventh grade coach, a different eighth grade coach, a different high school coach, and freshman JV varsity, but they've had me the entire time. So there's going to be an inherent kind of lean toward me and my program. But the main thing that I try to tell these players, especially them, is that it's in basketball, there's not a lot of wrong. There's just different. So, I mean, there's how many different ways can we think of to defend a pick and roll, for example? So if I happen to emphasize kind of a trap the pick and roll, and your high school coach happens to emphasize just a switch, that doesn't mean either one of those things is wrong. It's just different. So what I try to emphasize is everything that you're taught, whether it's by me or by your high school coach, it's just another tool. So there might come a time where the problem in front of you is going to require that different tool. So I think as long as you emphasize that versus saying, you know what, your high school coach is wrong or your AAU coach is wrong, I think that helps the player, because that player has more perspectives. It has more tools to draw from on the basketball court. And that's really worked out for me, because initially that wasn't the case. You know, I have an ego just like everybody else. So initially, you know, you started like, oh no, man, that guy's wrong, or no, that guy's not doing it the right way. But, you know, I think with the maturity, both of age and of age within the sport, I think I've learned that, I mean, in basketball, there's 1,000 ways to skin the cat. So it's just, the thing that I emphasize again is just it's different, not wrong. So as long as we're all on that same page, I think we can be successful.
And you might even come across instances where, you know, if I'm a high school coach and the AAU coach, you know, says that I'm wrong, like if I can't change their mind, or I can't work with them, and hopefully I'd be able to, I think that it's in my best interest to still remain like positive and just say, hey, it's just like, you know, they can say, you know, I'm wrong or whatever, but like, this is the tool that we're doing, and this is the way that we're doing things, versus a situation where, you know, they hear from an AAU coach like, hey, your high school coach is wrong. High school coach is, hey, your AAU coach is wrong. And then all of a sudden, like as a player, I feel like you almost have to like choose or pick sides. And I don't know about you, but I feel like that would be the worst sort of position we could put our players in, when we almost force them to, you know, side with someone and go with them.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That couldn't be more true. So early on, there's one particular coach that I think had a very negative opinion of me, or actually of me specifically, and of our program. And one of the statements that the coach made was to a player that was already getting college interest as a junior, told her, hey, man, you need to go to a real program, like where they're actually going to teach you something. And so that obviously kind of came at my ego, like I was talking earlier. But I think I kind of managed to where, if there's something specific that is being said that maybe I'm teaching incorrectly or whatever the case may be, what I try to do is I try to tell the player, look, this is the overall concept, and this is why I teach that thing the way I teach that thing, because in our way of doing things, this leads to this, which leads to that, which leads to that, and your team on the high school side has a whole different concept that requires a whole different approach to, you know, the pick and roll or whatever it is that we're talking about at the time. But it definitely, that type of crosstalk, I guess, where you're putting a player in a situation where they have to choose, I think that's as bad as it gets when it comes to for the player, because again, they're going to have certain allegiances. They're going to have certain like feelings toward their AAU coach that they've been with forever, but they also want to be successful in high school. So they can't just say, no, my high school, you know, so it's such a negative position to put a player in. And I think that's one of the times that we have to really remind ourselves why we do what we do. Like why you're a high school coach and why I'm a AAU coach. And it shouldn't have anything to do with me and with you. It should have everything to do with the player. So as we remind ourselves of that, I think you can move on from the ego bruise that happens once in a while.
As best as you can. Yeah, absolutely.
Sure.
Are you concerned at all about player burnout? I know that's always a hot topic of players who play, you know, AAU and then they play club, and or other multiple AAU teams and then their high school season. But when you're working with your players, is that something you're mindful of or work on? And if so, what's that like, and how do you sort of manage that?
Yeah, very much so. I really, really, really emphasize rest. I'll give you a quick early on in our travel, once we got into the kind of national level type of traveling, there was a local tournament here in El Paso, and my players were asking me, "Hey, coach, are we going to do this tournament?" The tournament was one weekend before we were going to go out of town. We were going to go to Austin, Texas. So I told them, no, I want you guys to rest this weekend. We're only going to have one practice in between now and then, kind of a walkthrough, and then we travel out to Austin. That we were rested and everything. So they're like, okay, but we're not doing the local tournament. I was like, no, we're not doing the local tournament. So then I look on our social media, and one of the teams that's in the championship game has like 5 out of my 9 players that are. So they jumped on as another team. Another coach asked them to jump on. Hey, look, your RS Gold's not playing the tournament. You should just come run with us. So it put me in a position where I want to really emphasize the rest. But if I don't do a tournament, these girls are going to get hounded by other coaches. They're like, hey, just help us out in this tournament. Just help us out. Hey, RS Gold's not doing it. Come on out, jump in with us. And I think we have to be really, we have to protect players from themselves from that perspective. Because I mean, I remember even now, like I still play flag football, and if you called me at 7:30 at night and told me, hey, there's an 8 o'clock game, man, come help us out, like I'm grabbing my cleats and I'm heading out there. But the players that hope to make a future out of the sport and everything, you really have to protect them from themselves, sure. Because they're gonna want to play everything, even if it might be detrimental to their future, both from like an exhaust standpoint, fatigue that really makes you prone to injury, and from a mental burnout. I've had a couple of players that have been so passionate about the sport, like early on in their youth, and then they get to high school and they're like, you know what, I'm kind of done with basketball at this point. Which is like one of the saddest things for me to see, when somebody that has all that talent and has worked so hard for such a long time just get completely burned out from the sport.
And it's one of those things I imagine that you have to be very like mindful of when you consider like how deep, the high school season goes and how much work their high school coaches expect from them. And I don't know, you can talk about whether or not all the high school coaches kind of have the same sort of schedules that they run, but I know certain high schools that they're going all out all the time and have deep seasons, do a lot of tournaments during the season, go deep in the postseason, versus others who maybe don't have as much success, and their players might come to you with different levels of how much basketball they've played in their high school season.
Yeah, and one of the current trends, and something that's being emphasized a lot here locally, is the spring and the summer leagues that are specific to the high school. So there's a lot of leagues popping up that actually get kind of not organized, but they get emphasized by the high school coaches, where you're going to go representing your high school. It's going to be your high school team. It's not very formal. I mean, they have refs, but they don't really keep track of like fouls or anything like that. The girls don't have numbers, and they just go out there and play, as part of their team. But a lot of them have 2 or 3 leagues that they're running. So they're going to play on Wednesday nights. They're going to play on Friday nights. And then they have to practice with me on Mondays and Wednesdays. And then we have games Saturdays and Sundays. So now you're talking about a full week's worth of basketball for these players. And at what point do they get that rest? So we have right now, there's spring leagues that are going on as we speak. And then as we transition into late June, then they'll turn into summer leagues for the high schools. And that's where I think we have to be a little bit more respectful and kind of be a little bit more mindful of the types of players that you have and what you want to emphasize for them. Because if you have, in my opinion, if you're a high school coach like yourself, you have, 12 girls in your varsity program, and 4 of them are in a AAU team that is a good AAU team that is really emphasizing development and all that. And then you have 8 girls that aren't in any outside league. Well, for those girls, absolutely, they need that summer league, they need that spring league. But for the AAU girls, well, they're already getting that teaching, they're getting that development, and in the spring league, at least here in Texas, the high school coaches aren't allowed to coach. So it's basically so it's basically pickup basketball. While they're out there, they're usually either being coached by a parent or maybe a senior that is graduating from their program. And so there's not a lot of teaching going on, at least not in game. So to me, I think I would much rather have a girl going out with a dedicated coach, practicing and doing their things with their travel program than going into one of these types of games. Now, it's absolutely necessary for the girls that aren't doing anything in the summers. Absolutely. And I keep saying girls, but obviously I mean players in general.
Yeah, of course.
But I think you have to be a little bit more mindful and differentiate a little bit between what you have. We do a lot of differentiating in the classroom, where you got your kids that are exceeding expectations. I think that's something that we can carry on here and say, okay, this girl is really important to my program, but she's very important to my program because she's developed so much in her AAU team. So maybe I let that development continue, and I allow the spring league to really focus on bringing my girls that are at a lower level, bringing them more up to speed and giving them all those extra minutes and giving them all that extra emphasis. But that's the big trend right now. And that's one of the big things that I'm having to contest with, because if there's literally a spring league every weekday. So if I make my practices on Mondays, I'm going to lose out on 2 or 3 of my players. If I switch it to Tuesdays, I'm going to lose out on 3, 4 others. So it's definitely something that I struggle with as an AAU coach. And if I tell a player, hey, look, just come to our practice, they're like, but coach, they're not going to let me play. I'm not going to start next season, and I'm not going to be and so it's we're placing the player in a really tough position.
It's interesting to hear all of the different situations that players get into, and overall, what I think one of the biggest takeaways I've gotten, kind of so far from the conversation is just how important it is for, your AAU coach and high school coach just to talk and just know what their players' like actual year-round schedule will end up looking like if they do both, because I feel like there could be cases where AAU coaches really don't understand the lengths and how long a high school like season goes on. And at the same time, I also think that high school coaches like myself sometimes don't really understand the amount of time that some of these AAU events take and just the overall toll that it takes on your players. I just get the sense that, there's a big maybe misunderstanding between a lot of the two in terms of like, hey, like overall, this is how much time we're asking for that player to commit to basketball. And maybe we're just not aware of the commitment overall that we're asking our players to commit to. And maybe that in part leads to like the burnout that you were talking about.
Absolutely. And I'll give you an example actually that just occurred very recently on my team. I have a young lady that her parents are very, very much that they very much emphasize academics as they absolutely should. And so the young lady has a couple of tests coming up, end of year type stuff, advanced placement courses, that kind of thing. And so she's didn't come to practice for a couple of weeks or a couple of days. And I'm like, hey, man, what's going on? And we're like, well, my mom doesn't let me go because, I have these tests that I have to study for. So if at first I'm like, just get her out of here. She's gonna have to balance. She's gonna have to balance academics and sports in college if she is lucky enough to go out there. But when considering the demands of the high school side as well, early morning practices, the afternoon kind of open gyms that they're strongly encouraged to go to, and then these spring league type games. And then aside from that is the practices, that it makes sense to me now, or like, kind of in retrospect, it kind of makes sense that, well, at one point, does this little girl get to read a book? When does she get to study? When does she get to do her academic side, which you want them to grow and academically as well? So that's another factor of when we kind of overwork these players and not understanding each other's what we're demanding of the players, both from the high school side and the AAU side.
Just curious, as kind of a follow-up to that, about what have your conversations been like with parents? Have you discussed that at all, about burnout and the time commitment that they're giving to basketball and everything? Because I get the sense from your experience that these must be parents that you've worked with and known for a very long time, as their kids have basically grown up in your program. So just curious about the conversations, if they have occurred, about burnout, or just any other like conversations basketball related that you've had with your players' parents.
I have, and I mean, every relationship with the parents obviously is different. I think I think the players, or excuse me, the parents have seen, how I interact with their kids, what I emphasize in my program. So I get a lot of trust from my parents. I know a lot of AAU coaches have horror stories when it comes to the players, but I have very few. I definitely I can count them in one hand. For the most part, I have a lot of parents that are very trusting of what I do. They entrust their kids with me for trips and things like that. And I have had the different conversations like, hey, you're going to get calls from coaches if they're not playing this tournament, or if they're not going to this league or whatever. Maybe just don't let her. Don't let her go out and do that one. Or I've had conversations with parents that say, hey, look, this other program is asking us. It won't interfere with yours, which is kind of a very recent phenomenon that I'm contending with, where they're like, this is one of those other travel programs, and they just want her to help out in this one tournament, but it's not going to interfere with you. Like, it's not going to interfere with the practices and this and that. And I don't think they understand that even if it doesn't interfere from a scheduling standpoint, when you have a lot of hands in the a lot of hands in the pot at the same time,
Sure.
Inevitably there's going to be you're going to come up with things that are going to be contradictory. That's going to put the player in a bad spot. You have the fatigue standpoint that we just talked about. You have, like, I kind of always refer to the concept of the development of a player as kind of like we're all kind of horses pulling the carriage, and if we're all pulling in the same direction, that player is going to be really successful. But if we start pulling in different directions, that player is going to pretty much stand still. And if I have one coach that's telling you to adjust your shot this way, and I'm telling you to adjust your shot this way, well, now which one are you going to do? And really what I've seen in my experience is that none of those things, that basically your shot doesn't change, because you're trying to emphasize something one time, emphasize another thing another time. And then from the academic standpoint, I definitely communicate with my players a lot to tell them that academics are first, because you can have all the skill, and then if you don't have the GPA that you need for a certain scholarship, well, your skill's not going to matter. So there's we definitely have conversations where if a parent says, hey, I'm going to hold this my daughter back from a practice, for the most part, hey, do what you got to do. I'm understanding, even though deep inside I'm definitely like, bring this girl
Yeah,
out.
of course.
Like the situation I just had, just a couple of days ago. But I think that especially early on, I had a lot of conversations with parents. I think now, because I've had them for so long, I think that we have a pretty good understanding of what's going on. So the conversations don't occur as often. And I do think that that's something that I have to improve on, that I have to, just as a kind of a check mark or a little waypoint, just like, hey, this is where your daughter's at right now. This is what we're emphasizing. This is where I'd like for her to go next, that kind of thing. And you have some parents that are very involved from that standpoint, and you have some parents that aren't, demands of work and things like that, or just a lack of knowledge of the game, that they're like, they just let the coaches do their job, which I'm perfectly okay with as well.
That's not a bad thing either.
Yeah, for sure. But I do think that I do have to improve in certain cases. I do have to improve in having those conversations, just keeping everybody in the loop of what we're trying to do, kind of as a community for their daughter.
when we think about, the ways that relationships or the dangers or pitfalls that could occur between AAU and high school coaches, I know we've touched on a few of them already, but in your experience, maybe not even your experience, or just experiences that what are maybe some other things that we haven't addressed outright yet that happened that caused this relationship between AAU and high school coaches to be damaged? And we can just start there. I know we've touched on a few, but are there any others that you think or you've seen in your experience that can cause those two coaches to just never get along?
I think we've talked about a lot of the kind of the pitfalls that I've seen and the stuff that I've kind of that I've kind of had to face throughout the different phases of our program. I think the number one thing is understanding that it's a community process, and I'll give you a quick example. So, just yesterday, actually, I was at the college signing for one of my players, a young lady that I've been coaching for since she was in 5th grade. So,
Awesome.
I've known her for about seven going on 8 years.
Yeah.
The high school, which I definitely applaud them for, it's the high school that I went to. They give each athlete, they give their athletes like their own moment. A lot of high schools here in El Paso give, like, when it comes to a college signing, like every player from every sport that's signing has like the one signing day, and you're sitting in your table with your school and everything, and you get about 5 minutes worth of of attention, and then it moves on to the different athlete. And in this particular one, at this school, and this is the second one that I've gone to in the last 2 weeks, because one of my other players from the same school signed as well. They're given their own little moment, and with that, everybody or the player is given the opportunity to say, okay, I want this person, and this person to basically give a speech on my behalf. So when I've gone in both of these signings that I've gone in the last 2 weeks, there was about 7 different people that spoke on behalf of the player, because they interacted with that player in one way or another, whether it was somebody like me that has interacted with her since she was in 5th grade, or the trainer, the volleyball coach, even though she wasn't signing for volleyball, the track coach, the basketball coach, their middle school. There was a lot of different people that spoke on behalf of the player that had a very important and crucial role in getting this young lady to the position that she was in. Mm-hmm. So in kind of bringing it back to the point, I think we need to really, really understand that player's development and that player's success is not dependent on you and you only.
Yes,
it is. Well, it is such a community type of environment there, where there's so many different people that contribute to the success of a player, that we need to make sure that we're being respectful of everybody's role in that player's life. So whether that's giving the player time with her parents, and whatever the feedback that the parents are going to give them. And giving, if we go back to what we're talking about, obviously giving the high school coach their time, their full season to be able to interact and just really connect with that player without an AAU player AAU coach getting in the way, and then vice versa. So right now is AAU time. So maybe from a high school coach perspective, we need to be respectful of that too, because as I've seen in all these signings that I've gone to, and I've been lucky enough that we're working on number 6 now for this year for my 22 graduates. And in every single one, you see all the different people that, if you listen to the player's speech and who they thank, there's just so many different people are part of that community that leads to their success. And I think that's the pitfall, that sometimes we think as a coach that, like, I'm making this girl better. Well, maybe. Yeah, you absolutely are, but you're just one person that's making her better at one facet of her life.
Yeah, I think it is really easy to kind of have that narrow point of view and kind of forget like big picture about all the people that are involved. And as you mentioned, the fact that like for that player to reach the levels that they did, it took them all these different adults in their life working together for that player's betterment, and not, just one person thinking it was all them or anything like that. And you almost have to like zoom out a little bit. So I completely agree with you there, that it's just something to always pay attention to, right? It's always something to be aware that it's not just you, it's a team effort to make this sort of thing happen.
Yeah, I lost you there for a second, Coach, but I think I think you just reiterated like the importance of that, of kind of like you said, to kind of zoom out and see the overall picture, and your role in that picture. I think I take a lot of pride in the role that I play in, or that I played. I take a lot of pride in that, but I also have to be cognizant of the fact that it definitely wasn't me and me only. And like, again, I think it's very telling when you see the thank you speeches that the players give at these big moments, because it's in those big moments that they kind of start really thinking about their whole journey, and then they start picking out the people that had the most influence in that journey. And I mean, usually that comes out to about 7, 8, 9, 10 people. So
you hope you make it on the list.
Exactly. So there's like little nerves of whether or not you make it on the list. And I'll give you another quick little example. So this particular player also, just she's fresh in my mind because we literally just went to it yesterday. But when she sent me the message to invite me to the signing, she asked me for my wife's number. And she's like, "Hey, I'm going to, Coach, can you give me your wife's number?" Because she was also really, really important to me and early on in the development and everything. And my wife coached cross country, and this particular young lady ran cross country also. So my wife was completely taken back by it, and really kind of in a really positive way, right? Was really positively surprised at the fact that this young lady thought about her, even though she coached her cross country when she was in 7th grade and she's a senior now. But she was there for all the games because, she was there with me and my daughter. And so that's just another little example of how you never know who are all these different people that are having such a positive impact in all these players' lives.
Oh, that's awesome. Before we hit our concluding segment, Coach, I did want to ask, I was just curious, as a high school coach, is there anything that you think high school coaches can do to help prepare their players for AAU and AAU tournaments and events? I feel like we talk about it so much, maybe the other way around, what the AAU coaches can do for us, but what do you think are things that maybe us as high school coaches can do to get our players ready for these AAU events, which in some respects are a lot different than, a traditional high school game that they would go to on a Friday night?
Yeah, I agree. And it's interesting, it's interesting because even myself, I hadn't really thought about it from that perspective. Because even myself, I kind of always, tell the girls that the better they get here in the AAU world, the better they will be for their high school. And I guess I hadn't thought about it from that other perspective. But I think the number one and most important thing is just the development of individual skill, and emphasizing that a little bit more, especially later on and in the off season. Just the development of individual skill versus thinking about your system or your emphasis or your program. Because from a recruiting standpoint, and this is something that I emphasize to my players a lot, they're like, Kentucky's not going to go to a travel event and recruit RS Gold. They're going to recruit the individual player, and they're going to recruit her not because she runs a play really well or because she's a very good system player. They're going to recruit her because of her individual skill. So if we can emphasize skill and we can emphasize development, I understand. Don't get me wrong. I am fully aware of the responsibilities of a high school coach and the demands for results and just the way coaching in general works. But if we can, especially toward the end of the season or, in the off-season type programs, if we can emphasize just like one or two moves, and I hate to say that word, like moves, but just one or two extra tools that are going to allow that player to show out because ultimately these are showcases, and you have to. I mean, we went to one in Colorado, and they said there was 150 something college coaches that were there, but there was several thousand players. So
yeah,
are you? You're not going to show out, and you're not going to gain the like you're not going to get a coach to look at you because because of all the little things, because you're great rotating or whatever. You're going to have to capture that coach's attention by your skill set, and then as they do their due diligence and they do their scouting, then they'll see the fact that you're great at doing the little things, and you can run a motion very well and all those things. But ultimately what gets the spotlight on you is going to be your individual skill set. So I think that's one way that if you're really talking about helping them for these types of events, I think that's the number one thing that I would emphasize.
And I think that that's a really interesting point, because I know I've coached players and girls in particular who are very like great teammates. They're really great team players who don't like a lot of attention on themselves and just want to do the things that are going to help their team win. But you said if you have a showcase where there's a lot of like collegiate coaches and things like that out there, you almost have to, in a good way, almost kind of turn on your selfishness a little bit and sort of put the spotlight on you. Otherwise, you'll just sort of disappear, like you said, right? When you have thousands of people who attend these events.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm very much a team first type of coach. I'm a little old school in that sense, where I emphasize, paint touches, and
Oh yeah, there you go.
I have to battle against the Curry, that Curry mindset and everything. But I have learned through this process that you still have to give them their personality. You still have to allow them to flourish as individuals, because ultimately it's going to be their individualism, whether, like you were saying, their little bit of selfishness that's going to get them looked at. You can put film together and everything, but ultimately when a player is being looked at live, that girl better show something, or they're just going to move on to that next player. Like, you literally have 40 girls rotating through a court every hour. So
yeah.
if
get out, you better.
Yeah, and you still have to contend on the fact that you're not going to be on the court the entire time, right? I try to carry 10 at most 12 players on my teams. But that still means a lot of rotating. So you're going to get, let's say in a 20-minute half, you're going to get 10 minutes. And you better show out in those 10 minutes if your goal is to get the attention of a college coach. So that really leads to your personal and your individual ability.
I'm glad we touched on that, because it is something I just don't think that sometimes, we as high school coaches think about. But, yeah, you're right. If we want those opportunities to exist for our players who are going to go to these events and go to these things, we really got to make sure they know what's expected of them, and kind of maybe in some cases a little bit of a personality shift that they're going to have to undergo. So no, I'm really glad that we did touch on that. And Coach, to wrap up, there's a couple questions I ask every guest, so I'm going to go ahead and get started here with this first one. Looking back on your coaching career, what is a moment from that career that you think others listening would be able to learn from?
Ooh, that's a really good question. I think, and again, there's the recency bias here, but in the last couple of weeks, I've gone to 5 different signings for young ladies from our program that have gotten the opportunity to sign with colleges. And the common denominator from the speeches that the young ladies gave, other than what we already talked about, one they all kind of said it in their own way, but one player in particular told me, or during her speech and addressing me specifically in her speech, she said, "Hey, Coach, I know that recently you've told me that I've gotten really feisty, that I've gotten really, like feisty in my personality." And this was a young lady that had zero confidence. She was very shy, very reserved. And in fact, I was like, how is this little girl going to play basketball? She doesn't speak. That kind of thing when she was young. And she goes, there's something that really, really, touched me when she said, you say that I'm like really feisty now. And she said, but hey, coach, it's your fault. You made me this way.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing that I think that I learned from, and that everybody can learn from, is that this young lady's personality transformed in my program. And if I had anything to do with that, great. But the emphasis here is the fact that as a coach, you don't just have an impact on whether or not the girl is able to put the ball in the hole. You transform and have a impact in every aspect of that little girl's life or young man's life. So that really hit home, where she said the reason I'm as confident as I am is really what she was implying, is because of her interactions with me and the things that I've emphasized, and how much I've really emphasized her coming out of her shell and everything. And every young lady that addressed me in her signing kind of had a certain, in her own way, kind of had a similar sentiment. So I think that's something that you need to really learn as a coach, especially if you're going to dive into the AAU world, where you have a little bit more personal of relationships with this young lady, is everything you do impacts that player. You are as big of an example in those girls' lives as there is outside of their parents. So that's huge, in my opinion. You have, you can influence how hard they work in their academics, how hard they work at relationships, how hard they work in general, their personalities and how they evolve as individuals. And that's huge. And if you don't understand that, I think you can have such a negative impact on the player. You can completely zap a player's confidence, both on the court and outside the court. And so I think that's a huge thing that I learned in the last, hopefully I already kind of understood that. But the point really hit home here in the last couple of weeks as I've gone through to these signings.
That's awesome. Really, really appreciate you sharing that story. That's just really, that would stick with me for a long time. I know as a coach, if I had heard that and had that experience. So no, that's great. I'm really glad you had that. And thank you for sharing that. And to wrap up, Coach, I give every guest what I call a 60-second soapbox. It's your platform to get out kind of a final message, a final thought, a closing idea, something that you just kind of want to leave the listeners with. So I'm leaving this one very open-ended, and I'm not even timing you if you go over 60 seconds. So I'm going to let you just kind of take the floor and go from here.
So it's okay for me to rant, right?
Let's do it.
So I think our conversation has been very positive up to this point, but there is something that I've seen and I've heard a lot recently that I would really like to talk about and emphasize. So, and Coach, maybe you can also kind of give me your take on this, even though this is the closing moment, but.
Got it.
So what I hear a lot now is, and it's always been the case, but what I'm hearing a lot now in the high school side of things, and really early in the high school side of things, is this concept of playing your role, of understanding your role and kind of flourishing in your role as a player. Now, and I understand it, and definitely understand it at the higher levels, college and NBA, WNBA. But my problem with it at the high school level is that the way I see it, there's two different ways to emphasize a player's role. There's what I see as the correct way, and that is to emphasize what the player does right while you work on what the player maybe does wrong. And then there's the way to emphasize a role which I think is the negative way or the wrong way, and that's by telling them what they do wrong and emphasizing that they not do that on the court. So the most common thing that I've seen that has come up with some of my players is that they're told, hey, you don't shoot. You're not a shooter. That's not your role on our team. So there hasn't been a case that I've seen yet where that has motivated a player. Quite the opposite. As soon as I hear a player talking about the fact that they were told that shooting is not their role, there's always this demeanor of like kind of defeat. Like I'm a basketball player and I was just told not to shoot. So if anything, it's completely discouraging toward the player. And I would really go as far as to say that If you have a player that can't shoot, well, she's in your program. Maybe you should teach her to shoot versus trying to limit the potential of a player. And I think that's where I have the most issue with the fact telling a high school kid that this is their role, because to me, it limits them. If you have a freshman that just maybe hasn't gotten the right coaching or, you know, the right approach to their teaching, and by telling them, hey, you're not a shooter, you're my defensive stud, you're going to play defense the entire time. Well, I mean, what does that tell? What confidence in that player are you exuding? You know, to me, that you're telling that player, look, you're not going to get any better at the shooting thing, so just continue to do the defense thing. You know what I mean? So I really have a problem with the way we emphasize playing a role. I understand how playing a role is important for your team, but I think this is one of those cases in which we need to really emphasize what's best for the player. All right. That's it.
Yeah, I think to just put my little 2 cents into it, I'm not saying I'm perfect at this. I certainly make a lot of mistakes in this regard, but I am overall of the mindset that I would rather have my players be thinking the positive things rather than the negative things about themselves. I don't think it helps them or their development when they're filled with, you know, the things that they can't do, and they're going onto the court with that sort of space, thinking about what they're not supposed to do or can't do versus what they can do, or even if, you know, they're limited in a certain area. Probably the best way to word it, and again, I'm not saying this is anybody who's perfect at this, would probably be like this is something that like you're working towards like getting better at. Like, this is what you do really well, and you definitely want to keep doing that. And here's this other skill set that like you're gonna need to continue to work at, but here's what you do really well, and here are the things that you are going to get better at and are just going to have to work that much harder at to get to the level that you want to be at. I think it's just kind of the language that you use probably goes a long way.
Absolutely. And what you emphasize, right? Absolutely. The language that you use and what you emphasize along while you're trying to really sell the player on their role. Don't get me wrong. I mean, in order to win games, you have to have players that play specific roles. Like that's just the truth of basketball. But I think it's so limiting because I still see high school as a place to develop. I don't think anybody in their high school world, I don't think anybody in their high school role is already where they're going to be, especially a player that has like college level aspirations and college level talent.
Right.
I think it's so limiting and so discouraging for a player. So I think that this is another thing that has been recently emphasized. And I've heard, you know, player after player after player talk about, well, it's because my role on the high school team is this. I had an instance where a young lady gets the ball in the corner. The ball swings as it should. It swung to the corner, and she had a wide open three, and she gave it up and tried to kind of force a pass into a cutter, which turned into a turnover, obviously. And then we had about 3 instances of that kind of back to back, where young ladies are giving up a wide open shot that came to you naturally as part of like the development of the play or the development of the action. And then you give it up and force something that's not there just because you were told not to shoot. And I have such a problem with that. I really try to emphasize developing basketball players and not developing shooters or developing defenders or passers or dribblers, but basketball players. It doesn't mean that you're going to be the greatest at every aspect, but you should have a working knowledge of all of it, in my opinion. So it's just so discouraging, and I see the negative effects that it has on players. Where I have players that take a shot, like especially like right after high school. I have players that'll take a shot and miss, and then immediately look at me to see if I'm going to pull them out of the game.
Wow, yeah, that's unfortunate. It does happen.
Yeah, it's terrible, and I try to. This was kind of my general approach to life. But it's definitely something that I emphasize on to the players, and I think all of them can recite it, pretty much by memory. So I always tell them mistakes are okay because they're part of learning. The same mistake over and over is not okay because that means you're not learning. And then if they can go on the court with that mindset, I think they can be a lot more successful, because they know I'm not going to pull them out because they made a bad pass. Because they know they made the bad pass. What am I going to pull them out for? To tell them that they made a bad pass? They know.
Yeah.
So that's the approach that I try to take into everything, I guess, in my life. Because if you're not willing to make mistakes, you're never going to grow. But as just in this particular case, that kind of the role player kind of really rubs me the wrong way, I guess. So you gave me a soapbox, so I took it.
Hey, I love it, and I'm glad we talked about it, and I think that just ties into everything that we talked about. So I'm perfectly happy that we ended on that point. And Coach, I want to thank you for spending some time talking about a lot of things here. We touched a little bit about PE, talked about your AAU program, kind of the way it got built up a little bit and growing your AAU program, but also just the ways that you do your coaching and the way that you talk with the high school coaches and work with them. And I think there's a lot of real good insights and tips and things that we can do just to make that partnership just a little bit better, because ultimately, as we've mentioned many times here, our end goal and our end result is what's best for our players. And I think that for all of the coaching clinics and all the other things we can do to improve our coaching, I think that a hugely beneficial step we can do is increase that partnership and relationship with our fellow AAU or high school coaches. So this was great, Coach. Thank you so much. I know you're in the middle of your season currently, so good luck with the rest of that, and hope the showcases go well. And I guess good luck in advance to the 6 players you have who are going to be playing at the next level next year. That is awesome. Thank you so much, Coach. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Coach. I really appreciate it. You also made me kind of think of things from a different perspective, which is great for me. So I really appreciate you having me. It was absolutely fun. And then whenever you want to do it again, I'm absolutely all about it.
Excellent. Thank you guys so much for listening. This was another edition of the Basketball Teacher Podcast. We will see you guys next time.
Thank you for listening to another edition of the Basketball Teacher Podcast. Make sure to connect with us on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, or reach us directly through email at basketballteacherpodcast@gmail.com. Take care, be safe, and we'll see you next time.